Last time on Tenchi Ball Z, we saw the gang have to fight against a doppelganger Ryoko named Minagi, who was created by an evil scientist named Yakage in search of creating the universe's strongest sword, which he finally finds after Tenchi runs it through his abdomen. Afterward, things are peaceful for a couple of chapters until Minagi, now a space pirate, accidentally chases an innocent girl named Asahi to Earth, where she enlists the help of our main characters, including Minagi, to go on an epic galaxy-expanding quest to save the universe. But now that our heroes are back home, safe and sound, we're thrust immediately into an intense conflict between Ayeka and Ryoko over Tenchi's affections. Will our heroes be able to survive? What's up guys, CJ from Team Millennium Ninja here, back to cover the Tenchi Muyo manga. Now if you missed it in my last video, I covered the first half of the manga, so make sure to check that out if you haven't. And with that out of the way, let's dive straight into the second half, which starts promptly with Washu hijacking Tenchi's reintroduction of the main cast for all the readers unfamiliar with Tenchi Muyo, who just so happen to be jumping in at this point. And if this applies to you, yes you dear viewer watching this, make sure to check out my other videos explaining Tenchi first, because I won't be going over it in this video, and you might get pretty lost otherwise. Getting back to the story though, it does start back up with a few one-off chapters, including this one, which sees Washu trying to, and let me make sure I'm quoting this correctly, bring Tenchi's liking girls meter up to normal standards, which is basically just the author's way of giving an excuse for Tenchi to be a little bit more romantic with the girls, before falling back on the old bait and switch of implying Tenchi's actually going to make a choice, but it turns out it was a robot all along. Now isn't that just hilarious? All jokes aside though, these one-off chapters that get us back into the swing of things aren't too bad. In fact, I rather enjoyed them myself, but they do have a much more fluid characterization for the main cast than usual, I would say. Especially Tenchi, who's much less straight-laced in these chapters than a majority of the manga and anime series so far, as well as a heavy continuation on the fourth wall-breaking style of humor we saw here and there in the first part right off the bat, which kind of gets old after a while, especially when they don't do anything to change up the formula, with there just being a lot of jokes about Tenchi being the main character and wanting more screen time.
Which is some peak late 2000s abridged series writing right there. Or just High School of the Dead.
Though the biggest offender of fourth wall breaks is usually Washu, which actually makes a lot of sense given the future of the OVA canon, and is something that I'm completely down with. I just wish it was exclusive to Washu because of that. Personally, I think the role should have been solely designated to her almost in a Deadpool kind of way, because it's kind of weird when the other characters do it, in my opinion. Getting back into things though, the rest of the chapters here follow more of the everyday lives of the Misaki household, with the next being about teaching the girls, mainly Ayeka and Ryoko, proper phone etiquette, which is kind of a dull premise when put like that, but what really sells it is how Tenchi, and more importantly Grandpa, gets so into and over the top with the lesson. Other than that though, this chapter specifically is important in the grand scheme of things because it's the first time we see ryo-ohki transform in the manga, where she just does it like it's always been a thing, and there's a little note on the page saying that she can do that now, which is weird because there's no explanation, and since this hasn't been following the OVA 2 canon, we don't know if it's the same reason here as it is there, or if it's some other explanation, which really sucks me out of the story and makes me feel like the manga is less its own Tenchi story and more of just an advertisement for whatever else is happening in Tenchi at the time. Like how the first half started with an arc about a mad scientist and a doppelganger Ryoko, just like OVA 2, or the two Pretty Sammy chapters shortly after, which I imagine came out around the same time as the OVAs, or the second big arc from the first half of the manga, which saw the gang traveling the universe to stop a planetary coup, which sounds pretty similar to Universe, with even this very volume itself having the manga version of the first movie in it. And that's not all to say that I didn't enjoy this manga in spite of that, but I really wish it could have gotten the treatment so many other Tenchi projects get of being its own standalone story, detached from the other stuff that only really serves to distract from or complicate the story of this manga. And speaking of which, let's get back into the chapters where we have a couple more one-offs, with one covering a TV crew coming to the house to film for a show that's probably on HGTV right now, let's be honest, with Tenchi's dad getting in an accident complicating things as the girls take it upon themselves to try and show off the house. And I think we all know how this ends, with all the girls, especially Washu, trying to show off their crazy space powers and tech, which would usually be a problem to Tenchi, but rather than getting upset at the girls for freaking out the camera crew, despite the fact he told them to have them reschedule the shoot, instead he just forgives everyone instantly. Lucky for them that the producer of the show didn't believe all that stuff was real, I guess. Which honestly made for a pretty boring chapter in my opinion, since there really was no conflict or stakes by the end. It just sets you up for the,
"Oh no! How are Tenchi and the gang gonna get out of this one? Stay tuned!"
just to say,
It don't matter. None of this matters.
And afterwards, the next chapter sees Mahoshi's dad trying to take her home from Tenchi's house, much like Azusa did in OVA 2 with very much the same results. A very predictably boring chapter, and I don't really have much to say on it. Check it out if you like Mahoshi, I guess. And the last chapter of the volume is the adaptation of the first movie, which I won't be going over in this video since it's basically one-to-one, so I'll just discuss the plot and stuff when I get to the movie itself. And next up we have Volume 8, Chef of Iron. That's right, get ready for Shogeki no Sasami. But first, a couple more one-offs, with the first covering Washu trying to get to the bottom of why Tenchi is acting so suspiciously, with her using a camera to spy on him in town while he's buying a present, but she's unable to figure out who for until she leaves the lab for dinner, where it turns out they planned a surprise party for her birthday, which gets doubly surprising when Washu tells everyone it's not her birthday, finding out that Ryoko told everyone that it was, with her saying April Fools after being asked why, with everyone's reaction suggesting it's nowhere near April Fool's Day. And it was an alright chapter, mostly because I like Washu's little life lesson at the end, but the Ryoko April Fool's bit literally came out of nowhere, and I personally thought it would have been much funnier if she lied about Washu's birthday to everyone, just to get them to throw a feast like they did end up doing, but unfortunately the ending we got was much less clever in my opinion. Up next though, we get a couple double chapter arcs, starting off with one in which Ryoko loses her powers because of a mishap while Washu was giving her a checkup, with Ryoko discovering the joy of living a simple life without her powers, taking pleasure in household chores she would normally avoid like the plague, and living day-to-day life like a normal person. Unfortunately for Ryoko though, it's short-lived as she has Washu restore her powers in order to protect Tenchi from a creature trying to absorb him. And I really like this little arc and its focus on Ryoko enjoying her life without special powers, despite her initial rejection of such a notion. I also really liked her grappling with the idea of regaining her powers, wanting to stay powerless to continue enjoying life as a regular person with Tenchi, but ultimately taking them back in order to save him. A cool little arc I'd recommend checking out for yourself if you haven't already. It also has a callback to episode 13.5 at the beginning, which I thought was a nice little touch. And in the next set of 2 chapters, we follow Sasami's point of view as she's invited to compete on a cooking show for kids, where her main rival is a little baby Kagato.
Oh my god, he's so adorable!
Whose dad, it turns out, is the producer of the show and is a much bigger Kagato with a mustache. Luckily for us though, there's a little note letting us know that this has nothing to do with the real Kagato.
Well, thank God for that. I never would have guessed.
All jokes aside though, I did really enjoy this little arc, especially through Sasami's perspective, which is one we don't get to see through very often, with it being fun to watch her work hard and try to beat a little mini Kagato in a cooking competition. Sorry, I can't say it with a straight face. With her being asked to lose so little Kagato can live up to his dad's expectations. Instead though, Sasami tries her best and wins, despite Mustache Kagato trying to sabotage her, with her victory actually inspiring little Kagato to find enjoyment in cooking in the end. Now, it's not the most original plot to anything ever, but I just love the inclusion of Mustache Kagato and Kid Kagato as the antagonists. It's so goofy and doesn't take itself seriously enough that I can't help but smile while reading. As well, there were some other funny gags to break things up, like Tenchi getting wasted on the train ride there per Ryoko's provocation, as well as Ryoko wandering through the TV station, with her walking through walls onto the set of a show about ghosts, which freaks out the leading actor. Also, Washu and Sasami have a talk about whether she should lose on purpose to Kid Kagato, which shows off a kind of big sister relationship Washu has with Sasami that comes up from time to time in the various forms of Tenchi media and is probably one of my favorite character relationships in the franchise, just because it's so wholesome. And look, you don't get that a lot in Tenchi Muyo, okay? I'm taking what I can get here. Next up, we get another couple of one-off chapters to round out the volume, with the first being titled Simple Joys, which is about Grandpa, for the lack of a better term, enjoying the simple things of day-to-day life. A nice, chill little chapter, but one I don't have too much to say about because of it. And the next chapter covers the crew visiting Tenchi's aunt's hot springs yet again, which, as we all know, always ends well. And because of that very fact, Washu takes the impetus to invite Yume and Hishima to join them, who, if you don't remember, were the two big bads of the last big arc from the first half of the manga. And honestly, I think this chapter was the most egregious in rehashing old plots, with it basically coming down to the same thing that happened in OVA 1 episode 4, except Yume and Hishima are here now, which I will admit adds some extra fun to it, but that's about it for this chapter and this volume, with the next volume starting up a brand new arc that'll see our heroes traversing the galaxy once again. Starting with Ryoko recalling something from her past, a memory of a mysterious boy she dreams about briefly before waking up, who it turns out Ryoko gasp, may have feelings for, which she accidentally reveals to everyone else. In addition, she also mentions that she visited that planet in the past because there were rumors of a secret treasure there, a revelation that comes right on the heels of the gang running out of money. And I want to take a quick moment to highlight the references to past chapters here, with them citing their trip to Tokyo from back when Sasami competed on the cooking show as one of the reasons for their shortage of funds here, which is nice because it gives some credence to the seemingly disconnected chapters dotted throughout the manga, making it feel less like random episodic adventures and more of peeks into the everyday lives of the characters, adding just that dash of serialization to make it feel like it's not just there for filler. Getting back to the situation at hand though, as Ryoko tells everybody about her memories, Ayeka takes charge and rallies everyone to head to the planet from Ryoko's memories in order to find the treasure to bail them out of their financial jam, which is really nice writing on the part of Ayeka, since you can tell through her expressions and dialogue that she's doing this not only for the sake of getting the family back in the red, but also in an effort to try and cheer up Ryoko a little, since she's currently having a hard time grappling with the absolutely devastating idea that she might have feelings for someone other than Tenchi, which I really like, since I figure a lesser writer would probably take the easier route of having Ayeka get everyone to go in hopes Ryoko would give up on Tenchi so she could have him all to herself, which is a story we've seen before many times, and so I'm glad Okuda instead opted for a more original spin on it.
But if that characterization was too subtle for you, don't worry. Washu comes in to point it all out immediately afterwards.
And one last thing I'd like to mention before the crew sets out on their adventure is a little Jiraiya cameo, where we see Ayeka swallowing her pride and asking her father for money, where we get a fun scene with Azusa, Funaho, and Misaki as the ladies use reverse psychology to coerce Azusa into helping, though it was too late as the gang had already set off by the time he had tried calling back. But it is always fun seeing these three, so I like to point it out when it happens. For now though, the gang is on another intergalactic quest, this time in search of a legendary treasure. Shortly after setting out though, they run into an old pirate friend of Ryoko's who attacks them in an attempt to take the treasure for himself. Unluckily for him though, ryo-ohki is able to fend him off handedly, and the gang arrive at the planet from Ryoko's memories with little resistance afterward, where we meet the man of Ryoko's dreams, who kind of looks like a grown-up Photon from Photon the Idiot Adventures, and by that I mean he has a similar looking staff as a weapon, which is just another little nod of,
hey, look, listen, hey, look, hey, check out this other thing, hey, look, hey, 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 hey,
that the manga loves to do. And upon greeting our heroes, he promptly embraces Ryoko, who gently pushes him away before Washu begins introducing everyone, after which we find out the man's name is Ibara, and as Ryoko wants to remember what happened, he asks her to speak with him alone, where we find out about the last time Ryoko came to the planet, with Ibara revealing that the treasure the gang is seeking is a royal tree from Jirai, which Ibara had recently become the protector of when Ryoko attacked and defeated him during their last encounter, with her going to the tree afterward and embracing Ibara once she came back, causing him to become smitten with her for the last 800 years. With him asking her now that she's returned to stay with him, which Tenchi just so happens to pass by and hear while taking a walk to pass the time, which prompts Ibara to challenge him to a duel for some reason. I guess the implication is to see if Tenchi is worthy of Ryoko, but it also just comes off as fighting over her, since Ibara knows she's strong enough she doesn't need someone to protect her or anything like that, which is the best reason I could come up with for why he would challenge him here, you know, aside from the author just wanting to add some action, making Ryoko just some trophy to be won by one of these men. And during the fight, Ibara asks why Tenchi, quote, makes her wait, which is just a vague way of saying not picking Ryoko over Ayeka, something that Tenchi takes to heart, at least in the moment, but then when the arc ends, Tenchi and Ryoko don't actually end up talking about any of the stuff that's brought up here, or anything really, so it just seems like a waste of time, a way to, in a very contrived way might I add, stir up some conflict here before the actual big bad of the arc shows up, that being the pirate who attacked the crew earlier. Now he's returned, and for the sake of action, Ryoko can't just send him packing with ryo-ohki once again, so we get a multi-chapter fight where it turns out the real monster was the ship's control unit, which was actually kind of a cool way to do this fight here, with him capturing Ayeka, which, is this a trend? It seems like this is becoming a trend, with Ryoko saving Ayeka from the ship, and it all wraps up with Tenchi and Ryoko combining their powers to use a super powered version of the Lighthawk wings, something which Tenchi seemed to have pretty good control over in this arc, by the way. I guess he must be better at harnessing that power since the last big arc. And it's revealed at the end that the tree on the planet can show people the future, which is why Jirai had it secretly planted here in order to make sure that no one abused it, and that when Ryoko came to the planet before, she used the tree and it showed her her future of meeting Tenchi, meaning that she wasn't in love with Ibara first.
Oh, thank God. I mean, could you imagine a girl falling in love with more than one guy in the span of 800 years?
I wouldn't even want to imagine something so disgusting. All jokes aside though, while this arc did end up having some pretty great action in it, and I did really enjoy the initial setup despite not really caring about the premise, this little arc for the most part didn't really grab me, as I found the main conflict of,
Does Ryoko love someone else?
to not be very compelling, and Ibara was mostly just a clone of Tenchi for the sake of that plot point as well, so there wasn't really anything interesting to learn about him. I mean, hell, we didn't even get to learn about how he became a protector of the tree in the first place, which might have actually added to the arc as a whole, giving his character something unique that could possibly differentiate him from Tenchi. But instead, he felt more like a plot device that existed solely so Ryoko could feel conflicted, which is pretty boring in my opinion. Though I do like at the very end where Washu points out that Ryoko basically just came there to rub his nose in the fact that she chose Tenchi over him, all while killing the tree he was protecting and leaving him on this abandoned planet, which did make me laugh quite a bit. Oh, and if you were still worried about the gang's money troubles, considering that they didn't get any treasure like they set out to do, don't worry, Azusa sent them plenty of money to hold them over. And now, after that heart-pumping intergalactic adventure, we return to Earth for some more one-offs. With the first being about ryo-ohki with her newly acquired ability to transform in the manga, accidentally getting mixed up with a class of school children. Not a particularly interesting chapter to me, but hey, if you're a big fan of ryo-ohki, go ahead and give it a once-over, I guess. After that rousing chapter though, the gang head to the beach for the obligatory beach episode. Or chapter. Something Ryoko can't believe they hadn't done yet.
That poor fourth wall just can't seem to catch a break in this series.
But after the obvious beachside shenaniganry, the gang just happened to overhear an old woman protesting against some nearby construction, saying that a sea god lives here and will be angered by it, with the gang talking to her about what's going on, where we find out the city, or whatever, wants to build a theme park on the Cape, but the construction will cause some environmental damage, which the old lady is trying to prevent by protesting in the name of the sea god, with her admitting later as she talks to our heroes that she knows it's not real, but wants to believe in order to protect the Cape, where she has a lot of precious memories, which actually I kind of liked, despite this whole plot being one you could palette swap with basically any generic 90s anime slash manga and not lose anything of importance. Though I wasn't really a big fan from here on in, where it just kind of devolves into the typical gag manga wackiness we've come to see in the back half so far. With first Asami and Mahoshi trying to act on their own to make a costume to imitate the sea god, which I actually still like and does result in this panel, which I do love a lot, and I don't know why. Before ultimately the whole squad gets wrapped up in it, ending with Washu going too far as always and summoning a real giant snake creature that loses control but ultimately ends up smashing open a place where dinosaur fossils have been hidden, meaning that the construction for the amusement park will have to be canceled, which everyone counts as a win, but with archaeologists and paleontologists most likely declaring it a protected zone, chances are the old lady won't be able to go there anymore anyway, so I guess it's just a win for the environment, something that I thought was a secondary concern in all of this, but oh well, all's well that ends well, right? Now, the next one-off chapter I found particularly interesting for a couple of reasons, as it starts off with the house wrecked after an apparent night of hard partying by the main cast, with Sasami up early to clean the house and make breakfast, with her making some rice porridge specifically for Tenchi, who's helping her clean up, which gets ruined by Aika as she quickly shoots up from her slumber and scares ryo-ohki into knocking it over. And when Sasami sees this upon re-entering the room, she becomes upset and even shouts that she hates Aika and runs off. Now, one of the reasons I find this so interesting is because A, this seems like a bit of a contrived overreaction on Sasami's part, but it actually makes total sense given the situation. Sasami is the one who had the least fun last night. She got up before everyone else and is expected to clean the mess, which Tenchi is helping her out with, so she wants to thank Tenchi specifically with the food which Aika accidentally ruins. And B, this works especially well because Sasami is still a kid. She acts more mature than most of the cast most of the time, but she could still have childish tendencies, such as overreacting to a particular situation like this. Plus her being in conflict with Aika as well as any interpersonal conflict between the main cast outside of Aika and Ryoko doesn't happen very often in the franchise, so it's very interesting to see when it does happen. Now, like I said, I really like this and I find it very interesting, but this chapter does lose a lot of steam for me afterward, with Sasami hiding from everyone at Grandpa's shrine, where she ends up drinking some sake he had left out by accident, which knocks her out cold after taking one swig, which I really don't like at all, with the sudden and extreme effects of alcohol in anime and manga being a bit of a personal pet peeve of mine. Just check out my Lupin Zero video if you want to see a bit more of that. But beyond that, I also don't like the easy route this chapter takes of, oh, Sasami's just knocked out while everything else is going on. It's honestly pretty boring. I would have liked it better if Sasami, say, acknowledged her childishness in this instance and wanted to apologize, but also just wanted to wait some time and be the one to be childish for once. All this whilst the rest of the cast are learning a lesson about how hard they put most things on Sasami and should be more helpful around the house, which did happen in the chapter, but I just wish Sasami wasn't taken out of the equation after the initial stage. stage. But it does resolve with a happy ending of the house learning to appreciate Sasami's hard work at the end of the day, so at least they learn their lesson. And the next couple of chapters are also really interesting to me, and if you've been keeping up with these videos, you'll know why when I say that Funaho and Misaki come through for a little visit. With one chapter covering Tenchi and Funaho going into town together, where we get a little bit more of her motherly dynamic with Tenchi that we saw in OVA 2, which is nice to see. As well as some good established character traits like her talking about how she hasn't been to Earth in hundreds of years, and also her asking Tenchi if he'd reconsider coming to Jirai, with her saying something very interesting here. That being that there are, apparently, many forces at war with Jirai, which is something that is really never shown to be the case in the manga or anime, outside of maybe GXP, but GXP is, well, GXP. So it's a damn shame we never get to hear or see more about this, because that sounds way more interesting than most of the stuff from this manga, and unfortunately we'll probably never get the focus it should. Though the rest of the chapter is very fun, with an assassin trying to take out Funaho, which Tenchi is unaware of, but Funaho is totally aware of it. She deals with him pretty handedly while Tenchi is away. And I also like the last panel of the chapter where Ayeka frets about the possibility of Tenchi sleeping with his great-grandmother.
Only in Tenchi Muyo and Alabama. Oh, come on, CJ, you're giving me this joke? I expected better of you. No, I didn't.
All in all, a great chapter because I'm always up for Funaho and Misaki getting some more screen time. Which isn't over yet, because the next chapter focuses on Misaki and Sasami dealing with some monkeys that have been messing with the local farmer's rice field. And while there's not much to this chapter, with it basically boiling down to Misaki using science magic to help a forest recover so the monkeys don't have to steal the rice for food anymore, this chapter though did have some nice mother-daughter stuff with Sasami and Misaki. I especially like when Misaki jumps in the crowd of monkeys to save Sasami after they already calmed down. Good comedic timing on that one. And this chapter also sets up the next one really well, with Funaho and Misaki taking their leave after staying at the house for a while. Because of this though, Sasami starts to miss them, Misaki specifically, and is pretty sad. So Ayeka asks Washu to do something for her to help cheer Sasami up, which ends with Washu turning Ayeka's hair back to its natural color, which is blue, just like Sasami and Misaki's, which is a scene straight out of the true Tenchi novels, and I like how it was expanded upon here, using a full chapter to tell the story with a nice little wrap up of Ayeka expressing how she initially dyed her hair to impress Yosho, but now she just genuinely likes her hair that color. Getting into the next volume though, the next couple of chapters are a very interesting ball of wax, with it covering Mahoshi asking Tenchi to be her fake fiance to meet her nanny from when she was a kid. Because as we see in the flashback at the beginning of the chapter, which I really like how it was drawn by the way, Mihoshi made a promise to do so when she was a kid, and now with her nanny's health in severe decline, Mahoshi wants to keep the promise while she still can. Even if it means technically lying about Tenchi being her fiance, with some action sprinkled in to fill out the chapters featuring the crew fighting an intergalactic biker gang, which I swear isn't made up. And if you're a big fan of Mahoshi, you'd probably really enjoy these chapters, but I am not, so personally they weren't too interesting to me. I mean, the intergalactic biker gang is a hilarious concept, but as a whole the plot is so bland and unoriginal I couldn't really get into it. But in the next chapter, Mahoshi gets back to doing what she does best.
Trapping the gang in hyperspace and accidentally making their lives a living hell for a brief period?
Yes, actually. A very serviceable chapter, but a very predictable one at that, albeit with a nice Journey to the West reference included within. Though at the end we get a glimpse of something interesting. Shown in silhouette, we see the conversation between a father and son over the fate of their planet, which will come into play in the next chapter and lead us into the final big arc of the manga, with the seemingly young boy kidnapping Ayeka from Earth,
which is definitely a trend at this point.
With the rest of the cast feverishly looking for her to no avail, with even Ryoko pleading for her to come back by the end of the chapter, which honestly kind of reminded me of the plot of the third movie a little, though with much less gravitas obviously, as we see during the end of the chapter Mahoshi is being attacked from an unfriendly spacecraft helmed by Ayeka, where she declares that she will kill Tenchi, with it being obvious to you by now I'm sure that she's been brainwashed. And while I'm not really a big fan of brainwashing main characters typically in other stories, as it usually removes what makes that character special and their agency over the story, here I don't mind as much because usually in these big arcs Ayeka doesn't really have that anyway, with her mostly just coming along with everybody and getting kidnapped a good percentage of the time. So this actually does work out in a way that helps her character shine a bit more than usual, with them capturing her later in the arc and trying to undo the brainwashing, something that only Sasami can really somewhat do, with Ayeka being a bit more introspective and struggling with fighting the brainwashing. But that's jumping ahead a bit, because first the gang has to find her, which they do by attempting to go to the planet where the ship she was aboard was made, Oku 2, where upon arrival at the coordinates they find the planet to be gone in a black hole where the sun used to be, with the crew pondering on what could have possibly happened to the planet when Ayeka arrives and attacks them. But her ship turns out to be no match and gets disabled, being sucked towards the black hole, with Ryoko teleporting over to save her. But instead, Ayeka gets up and the two have a pretty great fight, ending with Ayeka actually beating Ryoko after she hesitates to strike the finishing blow low, with her thinking of Tenchi and Sasami's feelings, which ends up with them both being stranded on the ship, being sucked into the black hole. So in desperation, Tenchi uses his light hawk wings to pull them out, just like back in OVA 2, which loses a bit of its luster the second time around. But before it happened, I did really like Ryoko's attempt at a cool emotional goodbye to everyone. And the next chapter picks up after they all return to Earth, with them trying to undo Ayeka's brainwashing to no avail, like I mentioned earlier. And the chapter ends with Ayeka taking Sasami back to the person controlling her, whose name is Garyu, which leads us into the final volume where Garyu tries to brainwash Sasami as well, but can't for what I'm sure are obvious reasons. Because of that though, Sasami's able to ask him why he's doing all this, with him explaining that his planet was on the verge of dying with their solar system star. So in an effort to save the planet, they tried to move it to a new location via hyperspace, but didn't have enough energy to exit hyperspace. So for the past 600 years, the planet has been trapped in hyperspace, and due to this is breaking down rapidly. And so Garyu, as the prince of the planet, fully intends on going down with the ship, but also wants Ayeka to join him, because 700 years ago when he visited Jirai, Ayeka scolded him and he's been in love with her ever since. So he brainwashed Ayeka to be in love with him, but Sasami and Tenchi have thrown a wrench into things, and now he wants Ayeka to kill Tenchi so he can erase him from her mind, with him saying that Sasami can live but that there's no need for Tenchi.
He said the thing!
So in response to this, Sasami goes Super Saiyan, and by that I mean she turns into Tsunami, where Tsunami talks with Garyu for a bit, telling him that love exists between two beings, and that Garyu can't create it by himself. But Garyu doesn't listen and stays hellbent on having Ayeka to himself. So in response, Tsunami summons Tenchi and the others into hyperspace to defeat him. But first, Tenchi has to fight Ayeka, which ends up being a pretty cool fight with some very menacing shots of Ayeka, as she makes for a pretty awesome looking antagonist. But despite Tenchi not fighting back, Ayeka's ultimately unable to overcome her feelings for him, and so Garyu takes center stage to fight Tenchi himself, with him being strong enough to push Tenchi into using his Lighthawk wings, almost scoring a decisive blow on him when Ayeka throws herself in front of Tenchi to block it, causing Garyu to cut off his own hand to avoid killing Ayeka, which also somehow damages the planet's core, so now this planet's going to explode in 5 minutes, which will also probably destroy Earth somehow because of the hyperspace axes being linked or something. But don't worry, because Garyu undoes the brainwashing and Tsunami swoops in to save the day once again, much like she did at the very end of the Ryuten arc. And now this arc, I will say I enjoyed much more than the Treasure Planet arc with Ibarra, but it was far from perfect, especially with the final climax seeming very rushed once again. I mean, at least this time it wasn't the whole universe being the big end of arc doomsday ass pull, but it was very close, at least to me, especially with Tsunami coming in to suck out all the tension once again. And I also feel like the two big arcs in the back half weren't nearly as fun as the two in the front, with the ones in the back focusing more on a specific member of the main cast, Ryoko and Aika respectively, and putting a big focus on love being a major story thread in them, which I'm not knocking. I like romance as much as the next guy, and at least this arc had somewhat of a decent payoff, with Garyu realizing that forcing an unrequited love on someone is very selfish and inconsiderate of their feelings, which you should be taking into account if you really do love that person. But in Tenchi Muyo specifically, it's hard to really go all the way with that stuff because of the insistence on keeping the love triangle going, especially in the 90s. So I much preferred the arcs that had more pragmatic bad guys like Yakage and Yume, with Yume's motivations being much more fun and compelling to me personally, as well as the fact that those arcs focused on new characters to the story like Minagi, who I'm really sad didn't show up at all in the back half, though we will see her again eventually, as well as to a lesser extent, at least in my opinion, Asahi and Goge, with the two of them being able to carry the romance of the arc, which could actually see a reasonable conclusion, rather than focusing on one or the other of Ryoko and Ayeka, who we all know will stay trapped in the friend zone forever.
Or at least until OVA 5.
But with all that being said, if you thought the series was going to go out on that anticlimax of an ending, you'd be wrong.
Because it's gonna go out on a different anticlimactic ending. Nobody's satisfied!
But first we get a chapter where Sasami gets the hiccups and everyone's afraid she's gonna die for some reason, but it ends with a sweet moment between her and Tenchi, so whatever. The final chapter of the manga though sees Ryoko being propositioned by some old space pirate acquaintances who try to force her to do some dirty work for them, threatening her with the idea that they'll show Tenchi the things she's done in the past to change his opinion of her, which ends with Tenchi stomping the fuck out of those guys and telling Ryoko that he doesn't care because he knows she's a kind person, and the manga ends with Ryoko saying she doesn't want to live without everyone anymore.
What a cop-out.
Okay, who the hell are you and why do you keep jumping in my video?
Plugging my channel, Smoke Bomb!
And that's the end of the original Tenchi Muyo manga, which I feel had a much stronger start than it did an ending personally, where toward the end I was honestly looking forward more to the little 2-chapter arcs than the main big arcs, unlike the first half. Unfortunately though, with even some of those being weaker than stuff from the first half in my opinion. Stuff like the Seaguy group of chapters, which like I said could have been airlifted out of pretty much any generic 90s anime or manga. Also towards the end here, one thing that really sucked me out of the world was the big increase in magic science, which is how I like to describe the science of Tenchi Muyo, with it basically basically just being magic that can do whatever the person wants, with it being hand-waved as super advanced science. And I know that isn't something specifically unique to this series, but I feel it is a bit overused here, and there's not really any rhyme or reason to what can or can't be done, making it hard to get invested in anything, because every situation could theoretically be handled much easier, but wouldn't be as interesting as a fight. So instead, Tenchi has to whip out the Lighthawk wings to rescue Ayeka, who is always getting kidnapped! Seriously, it was starting to really piss me off with the amount of times it came up, because it could very easily be someone else, like Sasami or Mahoshi, you know, the two people that probably contribute the least when action is happening, at least in the manga. So I think that would work better at giving them some relevance to the plot, but instead Ayeka has to be the damsel, I guess. And overall, while my opinions on it may be mixed, I would say this manga was a pretty great, lighthearted, and fun Tenchi Muyo experience, with a little bit of something to offer any fan of the franchise. And despite it coming off more as an advertisement for other Tenchi projects for a good chunk of its runtime, I still did enjoy reading through it, and I especially loved some of the fan service that was thrown into the mix as well, like the Kagito clones from the cooking chapters, as well as Dominatrix Ayeka, to name a couple of things. And while I might have personally preferred a bit more depth to the stories within, I'd be lying if I said that this was the only Tenchi Muyo property to have that problem. And so that does it for No Need for Tenchi, but it won't be the end of the manga, with Hitoshi Okuda and the cast we've come to know and love returning in the all-new Tenchi Muyo, or Shin Tenchi Muyo. But that'll be a video for a different time, because next time I cover Tenchi, we'll be checking out a whole nother experience in the Tenchi universe, the 3-episode OVA series Magical Girl Pretty Sammy, which will actually be the first Magical Girl show I've ever actually watched. So I'm excited to see what happens, and I hope you'll join me there. This has been CJ from Team Millennium Ninja, headed back to the village, hidden in the internet.
Or at least until OVA 5. It's at this point where you have to wonder if I know what I'm talking about or it's just CJ giving me stuff to say.